blood on his knuckles and ice in his veins. Chicago's most feared kingpin hadn't cracked a smile in a decade. But one rainy Tuesday, a breathless, plus-sized girl tripped over her own shoelaces, snatching his favorite Italian pastry right out from under his lethal gaze, and changed his empire forever. Dante Rossi did not forgive, and he certainly did not forget. Standing at 6'3", wrapped in a bespoke charcoal suit that concealed the holster strapped to his ribs, he watched the harbor waters lap against the concrete pier. Behind him, 2 men were violently persuading a mid-level smuggler to remember exactly where a missing shipment of weapons had gone. Dante didn't flinch at the sound of breaking bone. His face was a mask of chiseled marble, his dark eyes devoid of any warmth. At 32, he was the uncontested head of the Rossi Syndicate, a man who ruled the city's criminal underworld with a terrifying, emotionless precision. He hadn't smiled since his father's funeral 12 years ago. Joy was a liability. Amusement was a weakness. "Boss," Leo, his right-hand man, murmured, stepping up to Dante's side. Leo's massive frame blocked the harsh wind coming off Lake Michigan. He gave up the location. The Moretti family paid him off. "Handle him," Dante replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that brokered no argument. "Then wash the car. It's Tuesday." Tuesday meant only one thing in Dante's rigid, compartmentalized life, Sofia's pasticceria in Little Italy. It was a tiny, unassuming bakery on 4th Avenue, with cracked subway tiles and the pervasive scent of toasted almonds and caramelized sugar. It was also the only place in the city that made sfogliatella a delicate, clam-shaped Italian pastry, filled with orange-scented ricotta exactly the way his grandmother used to. 20 minutes later, the sleek black SUV idled outside the bakery. The rain had started to come down in sheets, washing the grime from the city streets. Dante stepped out an umbrella, instantly appearing over his head, courtesy of a heavily armed bodyguard. He pushed open the glass door of the bakery, the little brass bell chiming a cheerful note that starkly contrasted with the lethal energy he brought into the room. Sofia, a frail woman in her 60s, visibly paled when she saw him. She quickly wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Mr. Rossi, good morning. I have your order." Dante approached the glass display case, his eyes zeroed in on the top shelf. There was only one sfogliatella left, resting on a lace, doily like a crown jewel. "Just the one today, Sofia?" he asked smoothly. "I had a rush order. Mr. Rossi, I swear on my mother's grave, I meant to save 2, but—" Before Dante could reassure the terrified baker that one was sufficient, the bakery door violently swung open, slamming against the wall. A chaotic whirlwind of wet wool, broken umbrella, spokes, and tangled, curly hair burst into the shop. Penelope Gallagher was having the worst morning of her 26 years on Earth. She was soaked to the bone, her favorite plus-size yellow raincoat was smeared with bus exhaust, and she was dangerously close to a nervous breakdown. Penny was a thoroughly plump woman, blessed with lush, heavy curves, a soft, rounded belly she usually tried to hide under oversized sweaters and thick thighs that currently chafed in her wet corduroy trousers. "Please tell me you still have it," Penny gasped completely, ignoring the towering, terrifying men in dark suits. She practically threw herself at the glass display case, her ample chest pressing against the cool glass, her wide hazel eyes locked onto the solitary pastry. "Oh, thank God. Sofia, I need that sfogliatella. I need it, or I am going to walk into the lake." Sofia's eyes darted frantically between the oblivious, frantic girl and the city's most dangerous mob boss. "Penny." "Sweetie, I got fired, Sofia." Penny rambled on, digging frantically into her massive, disorganized tote bag. Fired because Derek, my absolute garbage ex-boyfriend, used my work email to sign up for some sketchy crypto gambling site and gave my laptop a virus. And now I'm fat, unemployed, and soaking wet. I need the ricotta pastry. Dante stood perfectly still. He was unaccustomed to being ignored. He was even less accustomed to the sheer, unfiltered emotional display happening 2 feet away from him. He stared down at Penny. She was breathless, her cheeks flushed a deep rosy pink. Rainwater dripped from her nose. She was soft, unapologetically messy, and taking up space in a way the polished, surgically enhanced women in his circle never dared to. "Excuse me," Dante said, his voice dropping a full octave. Penny jumped, finally noticing the giant of a man standing beside her. She craned her neck upward, taking in the sharp jawline, the perfectly styled dark hair, and the terrifying, dead-eyed stare. For a split second, she was intimidated. But her hunger and her terrible day overrode her survival instincts. "I'm sorry I know you were looking at it, but I really need this," Penny pleaded, slapping a crumpled $10 bill on the counter. "It's a medical emergency. My blood sugar is crashing. My soul is crashing." "That is my pastry," Dante stated coldly. Leo, standing by the door, instinctively slipped a hand inside his jacket. No one spoke to Dante Rossi like this. "There are like 12 cannolis right there," Penny pointed out, crossing her arms. The movement only emphasized her generous bust and the soft curve of her hips. "You look like a cannoli guy. Very structured, very rigid. Sfogliatella is a mess. It's flaky, it gets everywhere. Trust me, it ruins a nice suit." Dante's jaw tightened. "I want the sfogliatella." Penny sighed dramatically. "Okay, fine, we'll split it." Before Dante could process the sheer audacity of the suggestion, Penny reached over the counter herself. Sophia was frozen in terror and grabbed the small paper bag. As she turned, her wet rubber boot squeaked on the tile. Her ankle gave out. With a yelp, Penny went down. Instinctively, she twisted her body to protect the pastry bag, fully accepting the incoming impact with the hard floor. Instead, she crashed hard against a solid wall of muscle. Dante had caught her. His large, scarred hands gripped her thick waist, hauling her heavy, soft frame against his rigid chest to stop her from falling. Penny gasped, her hands flying up to clutch his lapels. The paper bag was safely crushed between them. For a moment, the bakery was dead silent. Penny looked up into Dante's dark, dangerous eyes, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She smelled like rain vanilla and cheap coconut shampoo. He smelled like expensive cologne leather and something metallic she couldn't quite identify. "I saved it," Penny whispered, holding up the slightly dented paper bag. Dante stared at the ridiculous, beautiful, soft creature in his arms. He looked at the crumpled pastry bag. He looked at her triumphant, flushed face. And then something broke inside Dante Rossi's chest. A strange, unfamiliar muscle twitched in his cheek. His lips parted. A deep, rumbling sound vibrated through his chest, startling Penny. Dante Rossi was laughing. It was a rich, genuine, booming laugh that shocked the absolute hell out of Leo and Sophia. He slowly set Penny back on her feet, letting his hands linger on her wide hips for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "You saved it," he agreed, the corners of his mouth still turned up in a devastatingly handsome smile. He looked at Sophia, who looked as though she might faint. "Put it on my tab, Sophia." Dante turned back to Penny, his eyes dropping briefly to her full lips before meeting her gaze again. "Enjoy your pastry, Penelope. Try not to break your neck on the way home." He turned and strode out of this bakery, his men hurriedly following him. Penny stood frozen in the middle of the shop, her heart doing somersaults. "Wait," she said to Sophia, her voice trembling slightly. "How did he know my name was Penelope?" For the next 4 days, Dante Rossi was distracted, The Rossi syndicate was in the middle of a brutal territory war with the Moretti family, a ruthless faction trying to muscle in on Dante's Southside operations. Blood was spilling in the streets. Meetings were tense. Yet while sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table, reviewing extortion ledgers, Dante found his mind wandering to the soft press of a curvy girl against his chest and the smell of coconut shampoo. "Boss," Leo prompted, sliding a manila folder across the desk. "You asked me to look into the girl from the bakery, Penelope Gallagher." Dante's eyes snapped into focus. He opened the folder. Inside were candid surveillance photos, bank statements, and a background check. "She's clean mostly," Leo grunted, shifting his massive weight. 26, lives in a crappy one-bedroom in Pilsen. Graphic designer, but she was fired Tuesday. No criminal record. But she's in a hole, Dante. A deep one. Dante examined a photo of Penny carrying a bag of groceries, her thick thighs clad in worn-out denim, a bright pink scarf wrapped around her neck. She looked beautiful. She looked real. Explain the hole. Her ex-boyfriend, Derek Vance. He's a low-level grifter. He racked up 40 grand in debt gambling at an underground casino run by the Morettis. 2 weeks ago, Derek skipped town. He left Penelope's name and address as the guarantor on the marker. Dante's blood ran cold. The Moretti family didn't send collection agencies. They sent knee-breakers. They sent monsters. And they were going to go after this soft, clumsy, innocent girl for a debt she didn't even owe. "The Morettis have a crew watching her apartment," Leo added grimly. "Carmine's guys." Dante slowly closed the folder. The amusement he had felt at the bakery evaporated, replaced by a cold, possessive fury that surprised even him. "Pull the men off the docks. I want a shadow on her 24/7. If a Moretti breathes the same air as her, I want his head in a box." Meanwhile, Penny was blissfully unaware that she had become the obsession of Chicago's deadliest man. She was too busy panicking over her eviction notice. It was Friday evening. Penny was walking home from a demoralizing job interview at a boutique marketing firm where the receptionist had openly sneered at her scuffed shoes and tight blazer. She felt heavy, exhausted, and deeply insecure. Being a plus-size woman in a city obsessed with perfection was exhausting on a good day. Today she just felt invisible and worthless. To comfort herself, she bought a large pepperoni pizza and carried the warm box through the dimly lit streets of Pilsen. The streetlights flickered overhead. The air was biting cold. As she took a shortcut down a narrow alleyway behind her apartment building, 3 figures stepped out from the shadows of a dumpster blocking her path. Penny stopped, her grip tightening on the pizza box. "Excuse me, I just need to get through." The man in the middle, a scrawny, pock-marked thug named Carmine, stepped into the dim light. He held a steel pipe, tapping it rhythmically against his palm. "Penelope Gallagher, Derek's little piggy bank." Penny's blood turned to ice. "I don't know where Derek is. We broke up." "Yeah, well, Derek owes our boss 40 large," Carmine sneered, looking her up and down with blatant disgust. "And he said you'd be good for it. But looking at you, I guess you spent all his money on donuts, huh, fatty?" Penny's cheeks burned with a mix of shame and terror. She backed up, but 2 more men stepped out behind her, cutting off her escape. "I don't have any money," she whimpered, her tough exterior crumbling. "That's a shame," Carmine said, stepping closer, raising the pipe. "Because the boss said, if we can't bring him the cash, we bring him a message. Hold her." The 2 men behind her lunged, grabbing Penny's arms. The pizza box fell to the asphalt, springing open and ruining her dinner. Penny screamed, thrashing her heavy body, but they were too strong. Tears pricked her eyes as Carmine stepped up, drawing back the heavy steel pipe to shatter her ribs. Crack. The sound echoed through the alley, but it wasn't Penny's bones breaking. Carmine's eyes went wide. He dropped the pipe, gasping for air, as blood suddenly spewed from his mouth. A silver throwing knife was buried to the hilt in the side of his neck. He crumpled to the ground like a puppet with cut strings. The two men holding Penny froze in sheer terror. From the shadows of the alley's entrance, a figure emerged. The slow, rhythmic click of expensive leather shoes against the pavement sounded like a death march. Dante Rossi stepped into the flickering streetlight. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore a black cashmere turtleneck and a long wool coat, making him look like a dark, vengeful god. His eyes were fixed on the men touching Penny, burning with a rage so intense it seemed to warp the air around him. "Let her go," Dante said softly. It wasn't a shout. It was a promise of a slow death. "Rossi!" One of the thugs stammered, his grip on Penny loosening. "This ain't your business. This is Moretti business." Dante didn't slow his stride. In a blur of motion, he drew a suppressed handgun from his coat and fired 2 shots. Pull. The men holding Penny dropped dead instantly, bullets lodged perfectly between their eyes. Penny screamed, clapping her hands over her ears, and fell to her knees amidst the blood and ruined pizza. She was hyperventilating, her entire body shaking violently as she stared at the dead bodies surrounding her. Footsteps approached her. Dante knelt on the wet asphalt, ignoring the blood seeping into his trousers. He carefully holstered his weapon and reached out his large, warm hands, gently gripping her trembling shoulders. "Penelope." He said, his voice surprisingly gentle, completely at odds with the massacre he had just committed. "Look at me." Penny slowly lifted her tear-streaked face. Her wide eyes met his, recognizing the handsome, terrifying man from the bakery. The man she had scolded over a pastry. You killed them," she sobbed, her whole body quaking. "They were going to hurt you," Dante stated simply, as if that justified tearing the world apart. He took off his heavy wool overcoat and draped it over her shivering, curvy frame. The coat dwarfed her, smelling of leather gunpowder and him. "Why?" Penny cried, clutching the lapels of his coat, feeling completely unmoored from reality. "I don't even know you. I'm nobody. I'm just the fat girl from the bakery." Dante's expression softened, an achingly tender look crossing his normally hardened features. He reached out his thumb, gently wiping a tear from her plump cheek. "You aren't a nobody to me, Gatina," he whispered softly. "And as of right now, Derek Vance's debts are cancelled, because you belong to me." Before Penny could process the terrifying, possessive weight of his words, sirens wailed in the distance. Dante stood up, pulling her to her feet with effortless strength. He didn't ask. He simply swept her up into his arms, carrying her bridal style out of the blood-soaked alley and toward his waiting car. Penny buried her face in his chest, terrified, confused, and dangerously captivated. She didn't know it yet, but the Mafia boss who never smiled had just started a war that would burn Chicago to the ground, all to protect the clumsy girl who had stolen his pastry and his cold, dead heart. Sunlight pierced the gaps in the heavy velvet drapes, illuminating floating dust motes in a room that smelled of rich mahogany and expensive linen. Penny bolted upright, clutching the silk sheets to her chest. She was in a massive, opulent bed, wearing a soft, oversized silk nightgown that surprisingly accommodated her heavy breasts and wide hips without clinging uncomfortably. Memories of the bloody alleyway crashed into her mind like a freight train. Carmine, the knife, the gunshots, Dante Rossi. Panic clawed at her throat as the heavy oak door creaked open. Dante stepped inside, carrying a silver tray. He looked impossibly handsome, dressed in dark tailored slacks and a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing muscular forearms dusted with dark hair. His eyes, usually sharp and cold, softened fractionally when they landed on her trembling, plump frame. "Eat," Dante commanded softly, setting the tray on the edge of the mattress. It held a steaming cup of coffee and 2 perfect powdered sfogliatelle from Sophia's. Penny hugged her knees, feeling intensely vulnerable, her thick thighs pressed against her chest, and she acutely felt every ounce of her weight in the presence of this lethal, flawless man. "Where am I?" "You kidnapped me. You murdered 3 people in front of me." "I saved your life," Dante corrected, sitting on the edge of the mattress. The mattress dipped under his solid weight. "You are at my estate in Lake Forest, and until Lorenzo Moretti is in the ground, you are not leaving." "I don't understand," Penny cried, tears welling in her eyes. "Derek was just a loser, a terrible boyfriend who criticized my weight and stole my credit card. Why would a Mafia boss want me dead over a gambling debt?" Dante's jaw tightened at the mention of her ex-boyfriend insulting her body. "Derek didn't just owe them money, Penelope. My men tossed your apartment last night to pack your things. They found a false bottom in your work portfolio. Derek hid a ledger there, a ledger detailing every corrupt judge, paid-off police commissioner, and illegal shipment the Moretti family owns." Penny gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "He used me as a mule. He knew I was too clumsy and clueless to ever notice." "He underestimated you," Dante said, his gaze dropping to the soft curve of her bare shoulder. "And he was a fool who didn't appreciate what he had." "Don't do that," Penny snapped, suddenly angry. She pushed the tray away, the china rattling. "Don't pretend you find me attractive. I know what I look like. I'm fat. I take up too much space. Men like you men who own cities and wear $10,000 suits don't look at women like me unless it's a joke." Dante went completely still. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. He stood up, towering over the bed, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that made Penny's breath hitch. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned over her, bracing his large, scarred hands on either side of her thick hips. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating off him, smelling the intoxicating blend of cedarwood and danger. "I do not make jokes, Penelope." Dante growled, his voice a low, vibrating hum that sent shivers straight down to her toes. "And I do not let anyone insult what is mine. Your body is magnificent. You are soft where the world is hard. You are beautiful, unapologetic, and real." He reached up, threading his fingers through her tangled, curly hair, tilting her face up to meet his intense gaze. "Those rail-thin socialites bore me. They shatter if you hold them too tightly. I want a woman I can hold, a woman who can weather a storm." Penny's heart hammered against her ribs. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her heavy curves with such raw, unadulterated hunger. Dante's thumb brushed across her trembling lower lip. "Eat your pastry, Gattina. We have a war to win tonight." Midnight brought the storm. Rain lashed against the towering, reinforced glass windows of Dante's study as Penny sat curled in a leather armchair, clutching a lukewarm mug of tea. The estate was locked down. Outside, the sprawling grounds were swarming with Dante's heavily armed enforcers. Leo paced near the doorway, an assault rifle slung casually over his massive shoulder. Dante stood by the fireplace, methodically loading a sleek black handgun. He wore his tactical a Kevlar vest over a black sweater, making him look like a grim reaper preparing for a harvest. The stolen Moretti ledger sat innocuously on the heavy mahogany desk. "They breached the outer gates." A voice crackled over the radio, clipped to Leo's chest. 3 SUVs, heavy artillery." Dante didn't flinch. He racked the slide of his weapon. The metallic clack was loud in the tense silence. "Hold the perimeter. Do not let them reach the house." Penny trembled, pulling her fluffy cardigan tighter around her generous frame. "This is all my fault," she whispered, her voice cracking. "If I had just checked my bags, if I had just—" "Stop!" Dante commanded, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He knelt in front of her chair, completely ignoring the imminent threat outside his walls. He took her trembling, plump hands in his thumbs rubbing soothing circles over her knuckles. "This war was inevitable. You were simply the catalyst, and I am grateful for it, because it brought you to me." Before Penny could respond, a massive explosion shook the house. The concussive force rattled the teacup in her hands, spilling hot liquid onto her lap. Gunfire erupted outside, a terrifying symphony of automatic weapons tearing through the rainy night. "Leo, secure her in the panic room," Dante ordered, standing up, his eyes suddenly cold and dead again. He was flipping the switch, becoming the monster Chicago feared. "No." Penny grabbed his wrist, her fingers barely wrapped around the thick, corded muscles of his forearm. "Please, Dante. Don't go out there." He looked down at her hand, then back up to her wide, tear-filled eyes. To Leo's absolute shock, Dante leaned down and pressed a hard, bruising kiss to Penny's forehead. "I always come back," he promised. For the next hour, Penny sat huddled in a steel-reinforced subterranean room, with Leo guarding the heavy vault door. The muffled sounds of the battle above were agonizing. She paced the small room, her heavy thighs brushing together, her mind racing with horrific images of Dante bleeding out on his manicured lawn. She realized with a terrifying jolt that she cared for this ruthless criminal. He made her feel safe. He made her feel beautiful. Suddenly the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than the explosions. 10 agonizing minutes passed before the heavy steel door mechanism whirred and clanked. Penny backed against the wall, holding her breath. The door swung open. Dante stood in the threshold. He was covered in mud and blood. A shallow cut bled freely down his left cheek, and his tactical vest was scored with bullet grazes. He was breathing heavily, his dark eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Penny. He dropped his weapon onto the floor. Penny didn't think. She let out a choked sob and sprinted toward him. Her soft, heavy body slammed into his rigid one, nearly knocking him off balance. Dante caught her, his powerful arms wrapping fiercely around her wide waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed her in, the scent of coconut and vanilla, grounding him after the slaughter. "It's over," Dante murmured into her hair. "Lorenzo Moretti is dead. The ledger is on its way to the feds to dismantle the rest of their operation. You are safe." Penny pulled back slightly, framing his handsome, blood-splattered face with her soft, shaking hands. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." He dismissed his dark eyes, softening as he looked down at her. "I told you I'd come back." Penny stared at him, seeing past the blood and the violence, seeing the fiercely protective man underneath. She leaned up on her tiptoes, pressing her full body against his, and kissed him. Dante groaned a deep, primal sound, pulling her flush against him. His hands roamed over her generous curves, claiming every soft inch of her. He kissed her with a desperate, consuming hunger, a man starved of light, finally finding the sun. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Penny looked up into his dark eyes. And there it was. Slow, genuine, and devastatingly beautiful. Dante Rossi was smiling. It wasn't a smirk or a chuckle. It was a full, radiant smile that reached his eyes and transformed his terrifying face into something breathtaking. "What are you smiling at?" Penny asked, a breathless giggle escaping her lips as she wiped a smudge of blood from his jaw. "I was just thinking," Dante said, scooping her up into his arms effortlessly, despite his exhaustion. "It's Tuesday, and I still owe you a pastry." Penny laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he carried her out of the panic room, stepping over the remnants of his shattered world. He had burned an empire to the ground to keep her safe, and as she rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart, she knew she would never go hungry again. The Mafia boss who never smiled had finally found his reason too, and she was soft, clumsy, completely unapologetic, and entirely his. If you loved this thrilling Mafia romance, filled with heart-pounding danger, sweet pastries, and a fiercely protective hero who cherishes every curve of his clumsy queen, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a good plus-size romance where the bad guy falls first and falls hard. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another spicy, action-packed, dramatic audio story. See you in the next video.